Ladies and gentlemen, if you'd please take your seats, we'll begin the plenary session that is scheduled for 3 p.m. And if you didn't mind coming toward the front, that would be great, so we can have a little bit more concentration of the audience with whom we're speaking. So we'll give everybody a couple minutes to come on and grab their seats and join us. Great. So welcome to this, our panel on informing better policies through transparency. It struck me when I thought about kicking this off that in May of 2013 in Sydney, when the last summit occurred, one could perhaps have seen the storm clouds on the horizon as it related to the price of primary materials and extractives. But for sure, we sit here in Lima today where the storm has clearly landed, with an oil price of around $30 a barrel compared to over $100 a barrel in Sydney, where copper prices are down 40% in that period of time, iron ore prices down 70%, and even gold down 20 to 25%. So economies that relied on royalties and other extractive-related revenues for their main source of financing are in a very different place today. They're having to cut budgets and make fiscal adjustments that, if anything, make the issues that exist in the context of extractive industries, those that can drive wedges between government, business, and civil society, even more fraught than during the boom times. The EITI's journey has also been occurring in parallel, agreeing in Sydney on a standard that included more reliable and usable information, better linkages to the kinds of governance reforms that were needed, better validation, and reporting requirements that tried to get closer to the actual financial flows that were most important, including those with state-owned enterprises and at the subnational level. It's easy in the context of all the challenges that exist in this area, and I think in the earlier discussions today, we've heard a lot about challenges, to forget what an accomplishment there really has been. Because not too long ago, the words corruption and extractives were synonyms for each other. And today, it is close to universally accepted, if not loved by everybody, that transparency is the necessary first step for the proper governance and use of the revenues that come from the extractive industries. That's true of the 90-plus institutional investors who represent over $19 trillion under management who have associated themselves with the initiative, the 90 major oil, gas, and mining companies who've signed on, and the 45 countries who are publishing reports covering $1.8 trillion in extractive revenue from 31 compliant countries and 20 candidates. Having said that, one also doesn't need to look too closely at extractive countries to know that the EITI standards are not a magic fix. They are no silver bullet. Transparency does not equal accountability on its own. And while the EITI is a step or could represent multiple steps in the right direction, we need to do more to make this less about sending reports to Oslo and more about leveraging the actual information the reports contain to create better policies, to drive greater impact, and to create systemic reforms that will really change the lives of those living in countries who derive substantial benefit from extractive industries. We have right here panelists who are, I think, exactly the right group with whom to have a conversation about how to do this. And they are a group who, in the spirit of the EITI, represent civil society, government, and the private sector. And I'm going to start with Zainab Ahmed, who is Nigeria's Minister of State Budget and National Planning, and the former executive secretary of the Nigerian Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. Nigeria has had some big wins in transparency under the EITI. Recovering uncollected taxes, like the $83 million from Mobil in unremitted education taxes, identifying weaknesses in some of the regulatory bodies, auditing oil-related transfers to the subnational governments, and perhaps the biggest win that I think is on everybody's horizon is $9 billion of debts by the national oil company to the federal government, of which over $2 billion has actually been collected. So my first question to you, Zainab, is what was your first reaction when you learned about that $9 billion?
Thank you very much for that very interesting introduction. It wasn't too much of a surprise to us in Haiti because it took a while building up to that level. It was more from the public. The public was astounded. How could government have allowed that much revenue uncollected, revenue that the country really very badly needed? And also, on the part of the companies, they were also shocked that that kind of information came out because the companies typically have very good lawyers, very good accountants and tax persons working for them, and they did not think a government agency had the capacity to drill down that deep to find those underpayments. It was for the benefit of the people. Some of the taxes were collected. A lot of assessments were raised by the Federal Inland Revenue, and there's still a recovery process that is ongoing. Some of the under-assessments are contested, and therefore the court process is going on. But it's an ongoing exercise. Up till today, the latest NIT audit reports, 2013, which is not yet released, also has more of such recoveries. But on the side of the government companies, the National Oil Company as well as the liquefied natural gas company, also there was very significant amounts of taxes that could have been paid to government that was not paid. And I'm very happy to say that the current administration of President Muhammadu Buhari has put a lot of pressure on the companies, on the National Oil Company, on the gas company, and these payments are being paid as we speak, and a lot of recoveries are happening already. The NLNG is 79% owned by government. It is supposed to pay both taxes as well as dividends to the government. And over several years, it had withheld up to about $14 billion from the government. And for the first time, last year, the first dividends were paid directly to the Federation. And this is after several years of struggle by Haiti, different governments paying lip service to the information that is provided. But a new government came, they insisted this needed to be done, and now the monies are coming in.
So I think I know the answer to this question by what you said, but I feel the need to ask it directly. Would any of this have been found without Haiti's work?
Probably after maybe some forensic audit is done by some government that has the will to ask for it to be done, it will have been found out, because what we did is audits anyway. But it wouldn't have been found at the time that Haiti found it. It wouldn't have been reported in the consistency and the manner that Haiti had done it. It was year on year, more and more amounts were being recovered, and Haiti is saying, this is what has accrued to the Federation. These sums have not been remitted to the Federation. Ask this company to remit this. And it went on, and Nigerians came to understand that this was wrong. And people joined Haiti to add their voice to have these monies collected.
I think this is a really great example of part of what we're trying to say here, which is transparency is a beginning. And it allows you to begin to take steps. It allows citizens to begin to engage, to know what is fair and what is not fair. You have another example of something that NAETI did, which was to look at, in the period 2007 to 2011, how was the money that government collected and distributed to subnational governments actually being used. And that report showed that, in fact, those monies were by and large not being used to invest in what I'll call social services, things that would improve citizens' lives. So my question is, what's missing? What is the link? And did you sort of begin to find that after that report to cause money to be invested in the way that really could have people benefit from what, at the end of the day, are natural resources that belong to the citizens of the country?
You see, what had happened is we noticed that we kept reporting how many billions of dollars the country generates, how much of it is not yet paid to the Federation. We noticed that people, the Nigerian didn't really understand the quantum and the size and the value of these monies. So we made attempts to translate these monies into local languages. We made attempts to simulate the money using infographics. Then we thought that maybe if we take it lower down to the subnational level, then people will begin to understand. And that was why we now commissioned that report. And the essence of that physical allocation and statutory disbursement audit was to report how much accrued to the government, how it was distributed to the various tiers of the Federation, and how these monies were received. So we reported right down to the state level how much was received by each state government and how they applied those resources. And that was a groundbreaking audit. People could now relate directly to how much of this revenues actually came from their environment and how much did their governors get. And what was it the money used for? And people used that report and was actually able to ask questions about specific projects. So it became more meaningful, and it was meant to trigger more debate, to trigger more citizen action. And it's an audit that NAETI has to continue doing so that the whole of the Federation is covered and it's brought more up to date, because the last one is still, after all, just 2011.
So is it, in those debates, is it beginning to drive changes in behavior by governors, do you think?
Yes, in the sense that not just governors, but every person that is entrusted with handling resources knows that at some point there will be disclosures about how they manage the resources. It wasn't just about the state. The country has several special funds that we have created over time, targeted at specific purposes. For example, the Natural Resource Development Fund that is meant to take a component of the revenues from the oil and gas sector to develop other natural resource sectors. But it was used for so many different things. There's an education trust fund. The audit covered those funds as well, reported on the projects, and then reported on the utilization. And without exception, each of those funds were used for several other purposes for which they were not intended to be used for. And now there is an opportunity for recoveries to be made back into those funds by the current administration.
Well, I know that there are a number of countries who are EITI members who are now working to move to the subnational level, and I think this is a fantastic example of the power that information can have, and information brought down to lower levels can really drive change. So thank you for sharing that with us. Simon, I'm going to move to you. Simon Taylor is the co-founder of Global Witness and the creator of Publish What You Pay campaign, and which could be considered the predecessor in many ways of EITI. Simon, you've been a lifelong defender of citizens' rights to the proper use of their patrimony, of natural resources. And you recently detailed how $4 billion was basically misappropriated by 4 African countries, 3 of whom are actually members of the EITI, along with a number of other instances of misappropriation of resources. Hearing some of the positive examples and stories that Zainab gave us, knowing the other things that you've uncovered, is the glass half empty or half full?
working. First of all, a correction. I would refute the idea that Publish What You Pay is a precursor.
I think you have to hold this very close to your mouth.
How's that? Is that
There we
better?
go.
Apologies, everybody. I would say Publish What You Pay is not a precursor solely to EITI. It is a parallel institution, if you like, that continues its work. Its initial work was a call for a mandatory disclosure mechanism to require extractive industry transparency on a global basis. And EITI was a political reaction to that call, and here we are. Which brings me to something I feel I have to say, which relates to your point earlier about systemic reform. We cannot achieve systemic reform, in my very strong view, based on our experiences, without having checks and balances and systems that operate with trust. And as some of you may be aware, there's been a quite damaging threat to trust within the EITI process in recent times that culminated in the CSO constituency, by and large, walking out of a meeting, a key governance meeting yesterday. And I feel because of that, before we get into this subject of glass half full, I would say my answer to that, it literally is, the glass for me is half full. And I see it and expect it to carry on. And in that context, I think it's a general view of the constituency as a whole that we fully welcome the new chair, Reinfeldt, into his new position. And we're looking forward to a new era in building trust, I think, between all the constituencies, a way of addressing what happened yesterday. And you know, we're very impressed with the idea of constructive engagement between the CSO community and Reinfeldt, as Chair Reinfeldt, as he comes forward, and the other constituencies. We're very grateful that Chair Reinfeldt came to the beach yesterday and joined us for a robust discussion. He didn't, unfortunately, have the right beach wear on, so neither did many of us, so it was a bit of a hot occasion, but we had good discussions, and we're very grateful for that. But to yesterday, something like 40 countries were represented in the departure from the room for the key meeting, and the reason for that was there was an attempt to parachute in an additional candidate after the CSO constituency had chosen its 5 candidates for the new board. And this resulted in a constitutional problem that the CSO constituency could not go forward with. Now, what that creates is a precedent which has profound implications on the ground in the individual multi-stakeholder groups, and it simply cannot stand. So with that in mind, and the consequences of the fact that the meeting continued, there is a general consensus right now that the meeting and its decisions were invalid, and that there is now a need to move forward into this new era to meet and work out how to go forward. And I think the last thing I would say on that is that there are conversations going on, and so far I'm hearing positive vibes, which is good, but we need to get past this era because we cannot leave the precedent that was set yesterday standing. It is totally unacceptable. Thank you.
Well, I will say that I think that one of the secret sauces of the EITI is that it is a venue through which civil society, business, and government come together. That requires great trust, and it requires great balance, and it's a very rare occurrence when that works. And I think that the great thing is that, as you reflected, is that those who are involved in this conversation have already evidenced a great willingness to work together to reestablish that trust and reestablish that balance. And that's awfully important because I think we all recognize the value that the EITI can and has brought, and we need to continue to do so. So I think that that's a very good way to move forward. And I'm going to say one more time, you have to hold the microphone very close.
Just in response to that, I fully agree. I mean, it's hard to overstate. You know, a lot of us have got an awful lot of skin in this game, and I say that across all the constituencies, and I include, you know, the great efforts that have been made in the past by people in the Secretariat, and so on. And we've got from a place, you have to remember 15 years ago when this started, there was no minimum standard. It was an aspirational ask. That's literally all it was. But the central tenet of EITI is that civil society, independently without meddling, from any direction, and I think this stands, it's fair to say, for all the other constituencies as well, of course, is able to play the role independently to hold the various players to account. That's its purpose. That was the promise that was given right at the beginning. If you take that away, it is not EITI. It becomes a rather enfeebled audit process, and that brings us into the territory of some of the things. You talked about things that need to be improved. You know, we've had lots of conversations. Many of you will have heard in recent discussions about, you know, in some places there's very good data. Zainab just talked about some of the stuff that's led to very interesting outcomes in Nigeria. But in many places the data is highly inadequate, out of date, and so on. But we're moving forward into an era where the data should be better, faster, more realistic, more time sensitive. And that's why this point yesterday was so critical. So I just want people really to emphasize, I want people to understand here, nobody walked out of that meeting lightly yesterday. It was not a voluntary departure as stated by the then chair. It was a deliberate vote of no confidence in the proposition on the table because at the beginning of the meeting, the sixth candidate had not been removed. And that's really the essence of that. If you steamroller things through, we either have, as my friend and colleague Ian Gary from Oxfam said earlier today, we either have the rules or we don't. And if we have the rules, we should follow them. And yesterday the rules were followed, and I think you should see everything that was done yesterday and everything we want to do as a constituency now, together with our colleagues in the other constituencies, as how on earth do we get back into the way and fix, you know, a process of trust that will go back to using the rules without fail. And if we don't like the rules, we'll work them out how to change them at the board to make it better. The EITI is far from perfect and it needs further refinement. So none of this should be seen as a negative message. This is an opportunity to make this something far better than it has been so far. And that's, of course, what our ambition has been all along. So that's why I'm personally very cross about the situation yesterday. It never needed to happen. It was totally destructive, and it's wasted thousands of hours of many people's time in recent weeks. And that's really what I'm imploring. If we can understand each other on that basis, we can come out the other side, and I think it could be good.
So on that same note, we're going to pull it back to the conversation and say, half empty, half full. Half empty or half full?
It's half full because there are many other factors, of course, beyond transparency, which I'd much rather be talking about, I guess. You know, things like international cooperation in law enforcement, for example. You know, what is the point in transparency if you merely find out what happened but out of date, and then you later find that it disappeared into a bank account in London, and then you try to get international cooperation between judicial authorities, and it takes forever for that cooperation to manifest itself, and then it's highly inadequate, and by which time the money's disappeared. So there are vast problems with the collective global architecture to address the reasons why money generated from extractives and other sources doesn't often end up benefiting citizens.
So what do you think what incentives could be put in place so that countries address not only transparency in the narrow sense, but go after the rest of the value chain that you just described, whether it's the judicial part of the value chain or the enforcement part of the value chain? What are some incentives that could be put in place?
Funny, I'm often asked about the incentives. I remember very early on in this process, someone said to me, what's the incentive for oil companies to do this? And I said, how about we don't investigate your malfeasance in the particular country concerned, of which we knew an awful lot about what they were doing. And so I struggle with the incentive. I mean, do countries, or don't they, for the benefit of their citizens, want to get the benefit of resources that belong to the citizens of those countries, yes or no? If you do, we have to work out a way of cooperating. And that needs to address things like tax dodging. It needs to address the fact that you can right now steal money and launder it through the London court system and even get a judge. I'm talking about a very recent example that I've worked on, who effectively gives the imprimatur of legitimacy to the movement of those monies. And yet they're completely corrupt, and we can prove it. So at all levels, there is a failure to, I think, to create adequate cooperation that creates disincentives for stealing money on a grand scale. And I think the other thing to remember is it takes two to tango. This is not just about corrupt individuals. It's about the facilitators, the bean counters, the lawyers, the offshore tax havens, the corporate service providers who set up companies that are used to launder money. So some of you, for example, might have seen our recent expose of lawyers in New York on a 60 Minutes thing. If you look on our site, you'll see that. And the role of places like Delaware, but I don't want to pick on the US, there's many others. But in Delaware, for example, it's easier to get a secret company and hide who you are than it is to get a library card. I mean, some of these things really need to be addressed, and they work together with transparency. Back to your point, transparency is a key prerequisite, but we need the right level of transparency, and we need these other things too.
Great. Well, thank you. So I'm going to move to Michael Connor, who is the Deputy Secretary of the Interior for the United States, who has had a distinguished career in what we would now call sustainability, things that have to do with water and land and all the things that make our lives livable in the grand scheme of things. And having come from the west of the United States, he has spent a lot of time working on those issues in an area of the country that is getting drier and hotter, and forged agreements that have included those that have addressed water rights with Native Americans and with our border to the south, Mexico. The Department of Interior, I was realizing today, listening to other speakers, has responsibilities that in most countries are in things like ministries of mines and ministries of energy. It has a very broad portfolio, managing 20% of the land base of the United States, which is 500 million acres, overseeing development of 20% of the U.S. energy supply and contributing $360 billion to the U.S. economy. But with all of those things to do, it is no secret, if you follow the news, that the Department of the Interior has had challenges in the past in the governance of all of these different resources, including issues around royalty payments and royalty payments to Native Americans in particular. The U.S. published its first EITI report, December of last year, and I'm curious as to whether or not you think the EITI process is going to make the Department of the Interior better at managing these responsibilities, and how else it might improve performance for the Department of the Interior.
Thank you, Julie, for teeing up that very simple question for our benefit. I think the premise of your question is spot on, which is particularly for the resource issues. It's great with respect to understanding the extractive industry and how it's carrying out business on the areas that we're responsible for, but it also is a dialogue that needs to take place as we go through permitting processes, as we engage, as we get into water rights negotiations. People need to understand, the basic foundations of the information we're dealing with, good science on where we're headed, and why we need to make certain decisions in a certain way.
So we had an interesting conversation when we were preparing for this session, and I asked whether money in reported by the companies had actually matched what government records said, and you said, yeah, it was pretty much 100% match. Zainab said, okay, so then why bother, right? What do we need to do this for? And I thought the answer that both of you had was very interesting. So why don't you share that with our audience?
My reaction to that question was, from an accounting, from a reporting perspective, it was very encouraging to see in our first 2015 report the matchup of 100% of the revenues, the royalties that have been reported by industry, and those that the government had reported. I would say, though, that about of the $12.7 billion that we report, we had industry reporting on about 75% of that. And so we still have a gap reporting-wise that we need to deal with. But also, I think, tracking it correctly, having it reported from different sectors in the same manner is very encouraging. And the game plan now is to maintain that and expand that. But also, there is incredible value in disclosing that and reporting that and packaging it in a way that is educational for members of the public at large, and having them understand the magnitude of activity, the economic benefits of that activity, and where it's happening in their communities, I think also has a lot of value.
Which kind of is very similar, I think, to what you were saying.
Well, I asked because I thought it was good to continue to question what was the benefit of just doing a simple reconciliation. If you are a US or you're UK or Norway, you have already good record-keeping processes, whereas in our countries, it is not so good. In Nigeria, it has come to the point when we reconcile and there is no difference. So there would have been, and people were asking from the beginning, so if the figures match, so what? So from the beginning, Nigeria realized that it needed to do more than just reconcile, that we needed to confirm whether companies actually paid what they were supposed to have paid. And that is the reason why we are able to identify these underpayments of taxes and royalties that government can recover.
Yeah. So, yes, back to you.
Just one other thing that we are bringing, there's an element of civil society, NGOs who track us, who want us, who promote this type of accountability and transparency. But we are also bringing new people to the table, and you mentioned where we as a department and we as a federal government in the United States have fallen down on our responsibilities to Native communities historically. And a lot of it, one specific aspect is accounting for royalties due to those communities. We have gone to great lengths to correct our situation with respect to that, from an accounting perspective, from a transparency perspective, and from basically just resolving that particular set of litigation that was brought against the United States. But I think that's where we've seen the most wow from the Native American communities, is the magnitude of the value of some of this activity on their lands has included a lot more members of that community in the discussion about these particular issues.
Which can really change attitudes, views, build trust, and open up new opportunities. So, Danny Kaufman, over to you. Danny is another of our panel luminaries he was a pioneer, really, in the field of governance and anti-corruption worldwide, from his seat in various organizations over time, from the World Bank to Brookings, the WEF, and now as president of the Natural Resource Governance Institute. Had to remember what the initials stood for. There you go. Energy. To name just a few. And he was a driving force behind some of the tools that we all use day to day to speak about this subject. The Worldwide Governance Indicators, the Resource Governance Index, things of this sort. And Danny has also done what I think is really fantastic work to try to take this topic and turn it into numbers that can be meaningful to people. That the result of just the direct costs of corruption are equal to 2% of global GDP on an annual basis. And that's between $1 and $1.5 trillion a year. It's funny, you know, I notice when we're dealing in this topic and you put all the numbers in trillions, you can forget that the thing after the decimal point is still a really big number. And that countries with better control over corruption see this in their fiscal health, that over time their budget surplus or deficit can be affected by 5 percentage points. Now, when you think about 5% of a government's budget and what that can support in terms of social programs in a given year, these are really meaningful numbers. And so taking all of that, Danny, you know, I think we all can say that corruption is one of the most complex challenges that any government tries to tackle and any initiative tries to tackle. And with all the work that you've done, I think it would be very interesting for people to hear if you could give us an example of how transparency has, or how it could have, played a role in addressing real-life corruption problems in a country.
Thank you, Julie. And by now we are in the world of between 1.5 and $2 trillion, by the way.
Okay, inflation.
These-
We got to
yeah,
inflate my
the-
numbers.
Not only inflation, but updated numbers. But allow me first a more general comment, because it relates to the previous discussion. Before going into the fantastic results that come out from transparency, one half in joke, I have coined the notion of zombie transparency. Just transparency alone is not enough. And that's just having disclosures and reports in a country where there is no civic space, where it's repressive society, no free press, and there are quite a few, including, unfortunately, in EITI, that is not going to translate into accountability. And that comes not just from a belief, but that comes also from the data and the numbers. You just mentioned the multi-stakeholder group. By today, after yesterday's board, where I have served, there are 51 countries in EITI. There were 49 before that. So there are 51 multi-stakeholder groups and many other civil society groups associated in those countries. In how many of those countries they cannot operate in a way that it will lead to accountability, where these reports can be used transparently? So that's why it's so important what Simon said earlier. We cannot afford, at the global level of EITI, of giving the wrong signal and an example. What are we doing in these countries where we're trying to protect civil society and so on, by giving the example that civil society can be weakened, can be emasculated from the process? And that's why it's just so important to resolve in the next 20 hours the crisis that arose because the way of the nominations were done. So you're like,
We all believe in role models, and the organization itself is a role model for civil society throughout the world. So I think that's a very important point, Danny.
very important, and it comes out from the hard, rigorous research evidence. It is the combination of transparency, civic space, and let me also say rule of law is really important, and public finances, if we had to mention 4 things. So it's not just one ingredient. We cannot be always focused and obsessed by transparency alone. Having said that, we're not yet there in terms of transparency, so we have a major agenda ahead, and if you allow me, I can.
Absolutely, and I'm going to remind you to hold the microphone closer to your mouth.
Sure. So then in terms of examples, well, one of the most potent examples, and I'll save some time, in terms of what EITI can do positively and has done regarding disclosure of corruption, is what Zainab just recounted, and you were the leader there in terms of any EITI. The $8.3 billion missing from the national oil company that should have been transferred to the Treasury, which then became the Governor Sanusi $20 billion, and you can enlighten us later in terms of the exact numbers. But we're not talking about small change. But I would urge you, and here a little bit of PR, to go to our newly released library of about 40 cases, in-depth cases of corruption from around the world, which we have put online, resourcegovernance.org, where we have codified all kinds of different types of corruption in natural resources. I'm not going to take too much time just by suggesting a couple of examples. One is Gecamin's heavily discounted asset sales in the DRC. That basically was thanks to Bloomberg reports in 2011 that relied largely on publicly available information, often from companies themselves. One can do a lot from information that exists. Global Witness has done that. And another one is Angola oil block bribery case, Cobalt Nazaki, and the Global Witness first did it in 2010, then the Financial Times picked it up in 2012. Now, there are many, unfortunately, there are many other examples where transparency was missing. And only if transparency would have been there, the case would have been brought to light much earlier at a much lesser cost. Whether the Cosmos EO Group oil block ownership investigation in Ghana, where it was complete opacity about the bidding process for the block, the contract between government and the companies, and no requirement for the companies to disclose their true beneficiary owners. Similarly, with Congo B, the oil sales case, complete opacity about oil sales, non-disclosure, and also beneficiary ownership. And there is a fascinating case with Sokarin privatization bribery in Azerbaijan. It's just to suggest the link between these, both the positive examples, like Zainab had in Nigeria, as well those that we should have known better and have more. The opportunity we have, once we resolve the civil society conundrum, and I must add, as Simon suggested, that the new chair, Mr. Reinfeldt, has reached out, and he also wants to resolve this, so we are hopeful. Well, in that context, then we can move forward, and there is a new EITI standard for 2016 that many of us and many in this room worked really hard over the past year, which is a refinement from the 2013 standard, which, as Julie suggested, expanded it very significantly. In the issue of reconciliation of revenues would be very important in the next stage. That's already required. But very importantly now, a big improvement is that beneficiary ownership disclosures are going to be required. There's a time frame for phasing in, but that's a major new thing here. Let's keep in mind that out of this library of about 40 corruption cases, in about 1/3 of them, the real problem has been beneficiary ownership, is secret, basically secrecy regarding who the true owners are, politically exposed person, and it related also to safe havens and so on. As important is the issue of contract disclosure. The half empty or half full glass has been that this has been encouraged in the standard. It's still encouraged, but it's not yet mandatory. But knowing what the contracts are also part of the answer to your previous question to my fellow panelists. Well, reconciliation is great, but if we don't know what the contracts, really what they are, one would not know how much money they should have gotten in the first place. So that's the next big frontier, as well as resolving finally the project-by-project disclosure, where the final word of how to implement an EITI is pending the resolution in the United States of the Dodd-Frank issue, but we are very optimistic about that. That will happen very soon.
You know, it's funny when you talk about the beneficial ownership, I'm struck each time by how many of the cases that we do know about are the result of the bad guys turning on each other. You know, and there's a movie that's up for an Academy Award, Spotlight, that similarly, the whole movie's plot, basically, and the reality in Boston came undone because of people making disclosures that they didn't realize they were making. They became public, and then you could follow the thread. We've certainly had cases where people are defrauded by people who've been defrauding government. And then things come to light. So we have to count on people not remembering what they shouldn't tell other people. Danny.
Yeah. No, this is an extremely important point, Julie, and there I would put my hat as an economist. Transparency is very important, in part, because it alters the incentives, the cost-benefit calculation of whoever wants to cheat. That's why also reconciliation is very important. Reconciliation is working now in many places because they know that they're going to check. It's like saying, well, why did I need an audit if I got a clean audit? So that's needed. Well, the same applies in terms of applying incentives to this type of mechanism. In the United States, as you know, at least as well, there are monetary benefits for whistleblowers, yep. Very significant gains. Yeah. So, and in many countries nowadays, there are and organizations, there are incentives. If somebody did something corrupt, and there were 2 people involved or more, the first one to come forward and tell it all would get a lighter sentence. That's part of plea bargaining and so right. on. So we need to be smart on these issues also and complement transparency with other incentive-based approaches to solve the issues. And the United States and other countries have been having very interesting innovations in that context.
So go back to one of the things I said at the beginning. You've created some of the indicators and indices that we use and look at to think about ideas of corruption. Across philanthropy, government, there is so much more focus on measuring impact. So how do you think we can measure impact in this arena? Systematically, right?
I would start, and I may be totally biased today, like many of my colleagues, but by basically measuring the extent of civic space and to the extent to which we have an equal voice, civil society, think tanks, academics, as well as government and companies. Let's keep in mind, EITI is not a governmental initiative. It's truly a major innovation in terms of multi-stakeholder group initiative, not just government and civil society, but with companies. So I think it's really important. Fortunately, we have many measures nowadays to assess not only corruption and other public finance and much more economic phenomena, but also the issue of civic space and voice and accountability. And that's part of the work that we have done. We look at the trajectory of countries over time in EITI, and let's face it, we do not see improvements in civic space after a country joins EITI on average. There are a number of countries that have done so and others have not. And quite a few were improving before joining EITI. There was an incentive to join, perhaps, and so on. So I think it's really important to monitor that issue. The same with control of corruption. We do not yet see gains in terms of control of corruption on average, on balance, compared with before EITI or with control groups, other groups. So the jury is still out, and I think we all here have a major challenge in showing these aggregate results. But we have to go beyond aggregate results because not everything can be blamed or given credit to EITI. There are many other factors. And very quickly, I think it's really important to also measure intermediate inputs and outputs, not just disclosure of reports and how many reports it's produced and ticking boxes, but what kind of changes and real reforms have taken place in the country on the areas that are important for EITI. Last but not least, let's keep in mind, and that I go back to all the MSGs and the national coordinators, that nowadays there's an incredibly dynamism and encouragement for countries to tailor the implementation of EITI to their own needs. So there in some countries, the issues of social conflict are becoming much more important and being monitored as part of EITI. In Colombia, the environmental issues are important. In others, they are more the more traditional standards. So I don't think we should all be focused on measuring with just aggregate global indicators, but these should be tailored to the national needs and to what the countries are prioritizing in terms of their own level. Last but not least, data is really important, but quantitative data sometimes has challenges and cannot be done alone. So the qualitative assessment and the narratives and the context, which is part also of reporting, and you would know that very well, is also really important. So it has to be a more holistic approach.
Super. Thank you for that. So now, Stephen McIntosh, you get to play wrap-up in the first round here and are the representative we have of our third link in the EITI of the private sector. Stephen is the global head of exploration for Rio Tinto, and you've spent 28 years at Rio Tinto in more jobs and more countries than I could list. And that career, what it has spanned in terms of both geography and function, I think gives you a really interesting position from which to talk about how countries who are meeting the EITI standards and who are candidates, does that play a role in your thinking about where you want to invest? Does it play a role in how easy or how hard it is to do development in a country? When the rubber meets the road and you're on the ground, is it having an impact from the perspective of the private sector?
Thank you very much, Julian. It's my great pleasure to join you this afternoon. So I guess the first part to that question, is the country an EITI candidate or an active member? Does it play a role? Absolutely. It's I think, and I'd break that into two levels. At one level, I run an organisation that presently is exploring in 20 countries. Many of those are not candidate countries today. So they're very challenging jurisdictions, and we're exploring in those countries because of its innate prospectivity for minerals and metals. But there's no doubt that if you're successful, where are you most likely to be successful as an investor that wants to be there for decades? And the reality is it's going to be a country that is trying to become more transparent, that is trying to play to the rule of law, that will establish a stable investment framework that we can invest into. And so, as I said, it's two parts. We play a risk sort of trade-off between the state of advancement of that country. And I think the other thing I'd say to people in the audience is that, again, as you said, the reporting within EITI is backward-looking. We also have to remember that countries that today are resource-rich, deemed resource-rich, may not be in the future if they can't sustain that industry. So again, there's a lot of incentives for those countries to get it right. We're now at a cyclical downturn in metal and oil prices. And of course, where does the reduced spend go? It goes to the least risky countries. And that's the reality. So a lot of hot money went into, frontier jurisdictions. That's now retreated very quickly. So again, governments are really incentivized to take something like the EITI, implement it. But I guess my cry to the audience here and the countries would be you need to deepen it. So you really need to build capacity, inside your organizations. We need really well-functioning cadastras. We need really transparent licensing mechanisms because this, especially in hot markets, that becomes a really topical issue around who controls, who has what, the beneficial interest piece. We are obliged to do very detailed due diligence on all parties into which we may choose to invest. And there are times when we cannot because of what we find through that process. And so you need to realize that, for the big end of town, the onus is only getting greater on us from the regulators and government and civil society. So, we need to redouble our efforts to really be able to make sure that we're investing into, clean title and into a welcoming environment.
Talk a little bit, if you could, about differences between national and subnational. There's one of the things we're seeing is people saying, okay, I kind of got things working at the national level. It's time for me to add some depth and go to the subnational level. And I think in an awful lot of countries, you see a distinct difference in areas of corruption, areas of governance when that happens. You work and interact at the national and subnational level in most of your projects. How do you see that?
Again, another great question. I mean, the reality is any investment we make is into a community. And so the people most directly impacted are the people in the immediate environs of a mining operation. Of course, it may also bring with it significant infrastructure, rail, power, that has a much broader impact as you go into that area. And clearly revenues flow to government, and how those are redispersed into the communities and into the sort of the greater districts around mining operations is a very complex area. And one that at times can have us on the wrong side of various debates. And at the end of the day, we still operate in a country, so the laws of the country are the ones that we have to work to. But absolutely, we have to understand that we have to meet the needs and aspirations of local communities. And I'd make the point that when we do our very early stage exploration work, we are first contact, if you like. So the very first impression we make to a community as a representation of the company will last pretty much forever. And so, you know, there's an enormous onus to get that right. And I think to have a dialogue, to attempt to set a narrative and talk about, you know, the company's culture, the ethics of the company, and the aspirations we also have for the country that it may not have yet achieved. But it's a complex and very hot topic.
So if you were to give advice to national policymakers sitting in the audience of the 1, 2, or 3, however you'd like to take it, steps that they should take to make themselves the most attractive in the context of new projects that are coming online, what would it be?
Well, I think, you know, countries really want to, you know, to be progressing and growing as a whole, and the extractives industry is one important part of it. So just having a proactive business framework so that all business across the country can be conducted in a, you know, an efficient and effective manner just goes an awful long way. As I said, you know, the deepening of the quality of key institutions, because ultimately the institutions are the ones, to a degree, that keep the politicians to account, and they are the enablers of key pieces of legislation. And so there's a stability, if you like, that is gained through improving the quality of institutions. And I think specifically for the extractive industries and for governments, there is a recognition that this is a cyclic industry and they have to be thinking through the good times and the not so good and have policies that, to a degree, can cope with both. And, you know, and just think very carefully about the long term.
So arguably, the EITI is a way to have government behave better and have industry behave better and have civil society provide pressure, incentives to make sure that all of that is working well. But there's also the market. So, you know, I said earlier $19 trillion of assets under management are represented by 90-plus institutions that are part of the EITI. Beyond that, even more institutions that are now representing money that has committed itself to some form of socially responsible investing. What's the stronger incentive for companies? Standards like the EITI, or the shift in the way the market's looking at investing in companies who do things the right way?
You know, I think it has to be seen as a combination of a whole range of different influences, if you like. And, you know, there's a growing range of trends and, if you like, you know, pressures, expectations on the private sector. And, you know, I think a good example for Rio Tinto was, you know, the sort of the world leading, the first company to go to market and disclose the taxes paid globally. And it's because, you know, we could see that this was becoming a big issue. We could see that not understanding the flow of revenues into governments was creating an enormous amount of angst for us. And so, you know, it is those sorts of things that are, if you like, repositioning, you know, the company around, you know, looking to the future, but understanding we still have a business to run. So, you know, we still have shareholders to satisfy. And again, we have to have a narrative as the extractive industry, because it's so capital intensive, of seeing through the cycle. Easy to say, I would say, not so easy necessarily to do at the time. But it's, you know, it's trying to absorb all of that and steer a course. And I think, to a degree also, to take key parts back into the culture and the sort of stated commitments of the company.
Great. Mike.
I just wanted to add a little bit to that. I very much appreciate and agree with a lot of the comments that Stephen's made about the value of transparency, and the government's commitment to that helps create that stable investment framework. It's indicative of a larger stability, I think, for governments who are invested in the transparency that EITI calls for. And then, of course, as you mentioned, there is, and we're at the Department of the Interior trying to feed into that investment, I think, growing interest in investors to invest in sustainable resource development type of projects. And so, and I understand how that's also, helps create certain actions by industry. I would just also add, in addition to that transparency as it relates to revenues and how government processes and discloses those revenues and where they flow, et cetera, there is the transparency, I think, that exists in development with respect to being sensitive to culture and sustainability. And I think that's also an outgrowth of EITI. That's what I was trying to get to earlier with respect to that transparency transparency in one area, I think, leads to questions and more interest in other areas. And we're seeing that with respect to, reporting resource development, particularly in the carbon sector, oil and gas and coal mining activity has led to the question of, well, how many, it has a revenue basis, but how much greenhouse gas emissions is that creating? And how does this reconcile with your president's climate action plan when you're facilitating all of this activity? And it's leading to more transparency in how we look at those projects. But the bottom line is there's a lot of threads to this, and I think the most successful companies, and I think Stephen's articulated it very well, are the ones who understand all the different areas of transparency and go in that with a sensitivity when they go into a community about how to address those issues. It pays off in the end.
Perfect. Danny.
Okay, I'm getting a little worried. Yes, it can be done, and these are great examples, but the picture overall is so much more mixed. Some time ago, I had a database of 20,000 firms from around the world, did research on who bribes, who doesn't bribe. At the end of the day, it's incredibly divided. There are many companies nowadays that have decided to go the route of being productive, innovative, competitive, and they want transparency, like you are saying. But there is an equally important segment that thrives in what we call in economics rent-seeking, but thrives by having connections, contacts with politically exposed people.
That was non-constitutional into the hands of a former oil minister who gave himself the oil block in question that the two companies were buying. The companies concerned have made or tried very hard, but not in a very effective way, to suggest that they were, quote unquote, only paying the government. It's funny how they spent 2 years negotiating with this former oil minister and then were intimately involved in the cooking up of the mechanism by which the ultimate payment was achieved. The reason I'm referring to that is it essentially amounts to a defrauding of the government of more than 80% of the healthcare budget for last year, just to put that in context. It's just not acceptable. This is one of many deals which has left that particular government facing a very hard time in terms of income, because a vast quantity of it has been looted and laundered through, amongst other places, London in particular. But the point I wanted to raise is one of those companies was one of the foremost champions, and indeed one of its then executives stood with me on, I think, 3 hearings on Capitol Hill in Washington, in which that individual called for a mandatory disclosure mechanism. We're going way back, I forget the dates now, 2005, 6, that sort of era, called for a mandatory disclosure mechanism, to quote him roughly words to the effect of, to ensure that all of us disclose the appropriate payments. And so I, as a person who was one of the co-founders of Publish What You Pay, we resoundingly won the intellectual argument about whether these payments should be made in 2002. Why do we still not have credible data, I mean, in some cases it is, and a sufficiently granular detail this long later. It was a no-brainer. It was done. What are we still talking about? So I just put that out. And I would say one of the key factors has been resistance at every level, not by all companies, but by some in particular. And it's just not good enough.
There's no question. The battle, and I think this is an important point that you both have made. The battle is not won. And it requires everybody to keep at it. I think the good news is that there are global currents that are going in the same direction at the OECD and amongst government in general to limit the number of places people can hide and limit the number of places people can hide money and collaborate amongst the financial systems to share information. All of these pieces are reinforcing each other. And, I think that is an awfully important part of this as well. Okay. Well, let Simon say one more thing because he's jumping out of his seat. So, Danny, you have to give him back. Nope, that microphone's not good.
Does it work? If I try very hard. Just one really quick point. Had the SEC managed to promulgate its first rule for the Dodd-Frank Act in the 270 days it was mandated to do from the passage of the Act, I think it's an interesting factor that had they done that, the first rule, which was, as we know, sued out of existence a little bit by the API, would have been in place about 10 days prior to the finalization of the deal I was just referring to. So I put a question to everyone. Would you have gone through with the deal in which you knew the money was not going to the exchequer, but in fact into the hands of a by then convicted money launderer, which you also knew? Would you have gone ahead with that deal if that money was going to be disclosed in the public domain? Answer, probably not. So we're also talking about transparency as a deterrent for extremely large malfeasant acts. That doesn't mean you wouldn't have come up with another deal. The obvious answer would have been to say to the government in question, please take the block back off of the crook who stole it, put it up for auction, and we'll bid. And we wouldn't be having this conversation. But they went ahead in the full knowledge that nobody would find out. And their miscalculation was that middle guys who got ripped off in the final deal sued and put all the paperwork on the table, which is why we can now place individuals in the room and what they did.
Again, my point about you got to count on thieves turning each other in. Okay, so we have a little bit of time for a few questions. I think we have roving microphones, so if you raise your hands, someone with a microphone should find you. Either our panel, there's a hand over here that I can see. Okay. Oh, someone has the microphone. There we go. Let me just before you start say, please, because time is limited, two things. Please only ask questions rather than making statements. And second, please try to keep it very brief. And if I have to, I'll break in so that we can get enough people the opportunity to ask. So please go ahead.
Okay, so my name is Sheila. I work for the African Development Bank, and we subscribe to all the principles of transparency, etc. But often I'm asked a question by my constituents, which I'd like to put to the panel. And here's the question. The notion that the membership of the EITI and those in the pipeline skew towards the developing world and the underdeveloped world, that in contrast to membership from the developed world. And the question really is, what does this tell us about the potential effectiveness of the EITI, given what you've said about where the funds come from, where the clever lawyers live, and where the funds are indeed repatriated once they are stolen by whoever steals them. The second question, if I may, is simply this, that repeated reference is made to the fact that we can dodge laws because we have clever lawyers, we have clever accountants. And I'm just wondering, at what point do we think that these clever lawyers and clever accountants should be members of this tripartite? After all, if we only talk about them and they are outside, are we really likely to solve the problem of leaving the EITA only to companies, governments, and civil society? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let's take two more questions, and then I'll let the panel answer a few of them at a time.
Buenas tardes, mi nombre es Mónica Belin, soy periodista de Proactivo. La pregunta es referida a qué hacer culturalmente para poder cambiar este sistema perverso donde las personas pueden afectar grandes naciones o corporaciones con actos de corrupción, que es una reiteración que se ha visto y que recientemente en Perú, en el caso de Ancash, hubo un presidente regional, un gobernador, que malusó los fondos del canon, los impuestos que pagaba justamente la minera, pero lamentablemente nunca hubo una protesta que nazca de la propia minera de saber qué está pasando con los impuestos que están pagando. Esa es la interrogante.
Okay, great, thank you. And there's another one over there.
Thank you. I'm from Ministry of Economic Development of Russia. I have a question to Mr. McIntosh. Several times there was an issue of contractual disclosure that has been mentioned during this panel. But contractual disclosure means that at a certain point some confidential data could be touched upon. So how to reconcile the legal right of any company to protect confidential commercial data and requirement for more disclosure for the purposes of the ITI? Thank you.
Okay, so let's take those three questions, and you can volunteer for whichever ones you'd like. Zainab?
I just want to respond to the question asked by Sheila on when do we bring the lawyers and the accountants to the table. The beauty of the EITI process is actually quite robust. It allows countries to modify the process as long as the minimum is reached. And in Haiti, in Nigeria, we define civil society to include professional bodies. So we have a special committee of civil society that we call the Civil Society Steering Committee that actually has membership of professional accountants, the Lawyers Association, the Engineering Association, mixing with the individual NGOs to determine how the EITI works. And I think that's a way to bring some of these professionals to the table.
That's a great innovation, let's say. Mike, are you reaching for?
I was just going to add on to that particular question. I think if you have bad laws that are being circumvented, or laws that are being circumvented, they're bad laws. And we were talking about this with a country that was earlier today looking to be a candidate country. How do you incentivize companies to want to join an EITI process? And I think countries need to look at, what they might do from a legal standpoint. I mean, you can have a voluntary process that the various members of a multi-stakeholder group can mold how that transparency looks, and that process will develop as a result of those discussions, or you can have mandates coming from government that dictate a certain process, and a company wants to move forward with transparency, they can do it either of those couple ways. And I think they've got to be prepared to look at the mandates that they can put in to place as part of this process. But I think it's important to get there, and it can be through voluntary compliance, or it can be through strong laws that are not easy to get around through creative interpretation.
So who wants to take the Ancash question?
Lo puedo hacer en castellano.
Sí.
La pregunta fue en castellano de Mónica, la periodista. Yo soy vecino, soy de Chile. ¿Qué hacer culturalmente y relacionado con lo cultural? Primero, obviamente, está el liderazgo. El ejemplo del liderazgo desde arriba es increíblemente importante. Y por eso el proceso democrático es muy importante. Y si hay que cambiar al líder, hay que cambiar al líder. la parte de concientización sobre esta problemática de la corrupción es muy importante. Y ahí entra la importancia del poder de los datos. Y por eso EITI puede ser una herramienta sumamente poderosa. Con los reportes, si lo utilizan los medios de comunicación, si lo utilizas tú y todos tus colegas, y hoy en día este nuevo documento del 2016, el estándar del 2016, va mucho más allá en cuanto a transparentar al nivel subnacional. Y se utiliza esos datos al nivel subnacional. Se concientiza a la gente al nivel municipal, al nivel estatal, muchísimo más. Yo vengo del país vecino, de Chile, donde ha habido muchas mejoras en cuanto a control de la corrupción, pero recientemente tuvimos escándalos muy importantes. En países donde eso ocurre y hay concientización, se moviliza la ciudadanía y demanda cambios. Entonces, hoy en día están ocurriendo cambios muy importantes y muy interesantes en Chile debido a que hubo un escándalo, o dos en realidad, en corrupción. Así que eso puede ocurrir. Brasil, Petrobras, que es nuestro tema, todo eso. Es un escándalo enorme con implicaciones macroeconómicas fundamentales. Pero yo creo que en 10 años más vamos a mirar hacia atrás y vamos a ver esto como un proceso saludable, donde se está viendo muy bien cómo el sistema judicial está tomando el toro por las astas, está actuando, gente corrupta está en la cárcel, aunque sean superpotentados, y muestra al resto del continente que sí, se puede hacer algo al respecto. Todos los países en el mundo tienen casos de corrupción. No existe ningún país, aún en los más ricos, que no tenga corrupción. La calidad de controlar la corrupción y gobernabilidad se mide por la capacidad del liderazgo y de las instituciones de responder cuando hay un desafío, ya sea de gobernanza o en cuanto a la corrupción.
So let's move to the question about confidentiality versus contractual disclosure, and I think both Stephen and Zainab wanted to come in on that.
Okay, I guess again, it's a very complex area, the whole area of disclosure. And in particular, if we start to go down into contracts, because when you start to go into that area, you start to deal with things like antitrust or competition laws. And so I think it's how that's framed. Is it actually information it doesn't breach? If you like, various laws to which the companies have to subscribe. And I think in terms of disclosure and those requirements, you really want to make sure there's a standard reporting framework, if you like, a globally accepted one. Having every country invent a new set of disclosure requirements puts an enormous burden on the public sector. So I think those are probably the comments I would make.
I just wanted to contribute on how we were able to use the contracts that we had access to during the course of the EITI work. And we did this because the NAITI Act, there's a law that governs the EITI in Nigeria, requires that we must take care not to disclose any information that would predispose the companies to a disadvantage, a competitive disadvantage. So we make reference to the contracts only as it relates to the fiscal provisions of the contract, provisions that has to do with the community and with the environment. And we do sign confidentiality agreements before these contracts are accessed. So because we had this access to these contracts, that's why we're able to verify whether correct taxes or correct royalties are paid. But with the new EITI requirement on contract transparency, we have to sit with the companies and agree on some form of reduction so that not everything in the contract is disclosed, only some part of it that is essential for the process, and I believe it is possible to still do it.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think, business tends to state that there are, competitive secrets in every contract, and it affects every page of every contract. But it's clear that the clauses of the contract that are necessary in order to create the accountability that one is looking to create are the things that really do need to be made public, because that's the only way you can know whether or not the contract is being lived up to. So I agree with you. I think there are a lot of ways in which one can do this to balance out, as you said, the needs of confidentiality with those of credibility. Simon.
I don't know if this is this working? Yeah.
Yeah, you're better off. Could you hand Simon one of the other microphones, because it just doesn't work that well. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. I'm reminded on one level of how far we've come, and it goes back to this initiative we're talking about now. If we go back to the existence of Publish What You Pay in EITI, I remember early meetings, in many different places actually, saying, look, we need some kind of a mandatory disclosure mechanism to require you guys being a sort of sweeping generalization across the extractives, to disclose the payments you make. And the response was routine laughter. It was actually quite funny in retrospect, but rather amazing, I also think, because it was so obviously something that was necessary. And in the context of routine laughter, the justification was, these are all things that can't be revealed because they're all confidential. And then you think, well, who's the real client here? If you're extracting resources in country X, the resources belong to the people who live in that country. On what basis do you have any rights to have confidentiality around what you're paying for the resources that belong to the people of that country? Surely that's ridiculous. And it seems to me that some of the conversation of what is or shouldn't be confidential has moved on a little bit. And I'm just thinking now in reflection of other things we've come across over the years with different investigations and contracts that have come into our possession in all sorts of different ways. Very often things that are confidential, you just think, why? And hardly any of it really. I can see you don't want to put someone at a competitive disadvantage, fine. But once it's done, once it's agreed, what's the big deal? Unless, of course, you want to minimize your tax burden. Well, in some places that looks rather like dodging taxes, and it overloads the tax burden on the citizens in the country. So, these are political matters, I suppose. Can I just say one thing on bean counters and lawyers?
Yes.
I mean, who knows what one can do on an individual country basis, but certainly from our experience, I think there's a need to include them in the role of the prosecutorial target, because they very often play a very significant role in facilitation of really quite dreadful practices. So I would just put that out there. I think there's an incentivization process one could talk about, and there's a disincentivization process, and right now neither really exists, not on an international basis.
Like in almost any profession, there are good guys and bad guys, right? So we've come to just about the end of our session. I wish I could make it stop doing that, but I can't, apparently. And we've heard a lot in this discussion about transparency and the link between transparency, accountability, and good public policy. And we've tried to bring it to ground for all of you into real cases and how it plays out to make it more practical. But I do know that you get to this point in many an event like this and say to yourself, how do I go home and what do I do? So we thought that we would share at the end here a 2-minute video that is a video of a project that, to fully disclose, my organization, the Inter-American Development Bank, worked on with Colombia as a way to take transparency and bring it that next step further, to create a way to create dialogue and accountability with the citizens of the country, to create more understanding of the value of exploiting the patrimony of natural resources for the social benefit of those who live in the country, and to hopefully be able to then use this as a point to leverage to even better public policy. So the video is in Spanish, but the translators will be able to translate for you, so those who don't speak Spanish want to put on their headsets. And with that, let's roll the video. We have to turn around.
Y la pregunta es, ¿cómo mejorar el diseño y la implementación de políticas en el sector extractivo? Los aspectos claves: innovar, tomar riesgos, usar la tecnología que ya está en nuestras manos. Suena algo un poco abstracto, ¿verdad? Pues entonces veámoslo con un ejemplo. En Colombia, aproximadamente el 30% de la inversión pública se financia con regalías. Interesante. Decidimos entonces tomar la fórmula de los mapas georreferenciados y crear algo que más tarde llamamos Mapa Regalías. Una plataforma a través de la cual los colombianos pueden obtener información sobre los proyectos que financia el gobierno con el dinero proveniente de las regalías. Les presento a Santiago. Santiago quiere saber cuáles son los proyectos que se están desarrollando en su ciudad natal de Río Blanco, en el departamento de Tolima. Sigámoslo y hagamos un poco de magia con el clic. Aquí vemos el país con sus regiones, ciudades, departamentos, etc. Vayamos primero a Tolima. Como pueden ver, en Tolima se están llevando a cabo 161 proyectos. Ahora hagamos clic en Río Blanco. En Río Blanco hay 9 proyectos. Un poco más de magia. ¡Wow! Están construyendo una escuela en la ciudad natal de Santiago. Pero miren, hay aún más. Este proyecto cuesta unos 130 millones de pesos colombianos, que son casi $70.000 americanos. ¡Brillante! ¿Qué es lo que realmente estamos haciendo aquí? Muy sencillo. Estamos dando acceso gratuito a información pública para que todos podamos saber dónde está nuestro dinero y en qué está siendo utilizado. Y si todos estamos informados, todos podemos participar. Esta herramienta ayudará a nuestros gobiernos a reducir las asimetrías para así poder tomar mejores decisiones y por tanto ser más eficientes. La meta es que todos en Latinoamérica podamos aprovechar esta gran herramienta. ¿Por qué? Porque créanme, la tecnología es brillante, pero aún mejor es lo que podemos hacer con ella. Clic.
So I don't know why the speed of that video was sort of at twice the normal, so it was probably a little hard to follow. But as you saw at the end, there is a web address, and that is available in both English and in Spanish in Vimeo and on the web. So with that, I hope that everybody saw how, with this group of panelists, we were able to connect transparency and better policy and accountability, and that you'll be able to walk away with some ideas to bring home and help improve both of those things in your own countries. So let's thank all the panelists for a great job.
Por culpa tuya, toditos van a tragar sin comer. Temporal, mira que tarde ya, y el sol está por rayar, y la gente del galpón no quiere salir a trabajar. Y no sé qué rumor le siento, que me quiero alzar. Qué rumor ni qué rumor, que salga la gente a trabajar. Y no te dejas respetar. Y si viene mi amito, le vamos a tener que decir la verdad, que no somos sus esclavos y queremos libertad. No son todos mis esclavos, somos una fiel amistad. Así es.